I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I'm sad that my husband couldn't join us today. He's in Boston. Sometimes we have to, split tasks, whether it's children or lectures or work. But thank you for the kind introduction. I'm a neurologist, a vascular neurologist, and along with my husband, we run the Alzheimer's prevention program here at Loma University. I see patients in the clinic, and I also see patients at the hospital. I'm a stroke neurologist, and my passion is prevention of neurological diseases. I think I probably am, my husband and I were probably the only people who coined the term preventive neurology, and our focus, whether it's in the clinic or in the hospital or in our research, is to prevent degenerative diseases of the brain like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, but also vascular diseases of the brain. So today I prepared a few slides for you to go over the general concept of what dementia is, where we are as far as research is concerned for treatment, for prevention, and most of the time will be spent on what are some of the lifestyle risk factors that can prevent neurological diseases. We'll focus on Alzheimer's disease and stroke today, because then it's going to be a very long lecture if we include other neurological diseases in it. Let me see if I can point it to the right place. I'll figure this out sometime. All right. No worries. Okay, so this is the topic of our discussion today, the brain. Sorry, cardiologists and other specialties, but the brain is, in my opinion, the most important organ in the body. And we always joke around with our cardiology friends. We say the heart is there to support the brain. The rest of the body is there to support the brain, because you could do a heart transplant, but the moment you transplant the brain, you're changing the whole person and the personality. But the brain is an incredible organ. They've actually done a lot of studies to find out how many brain cells we have. And we now know that we have about 87 billion neurons, brain cells. And these neurons can have as little as 2 connections, which confers information transfer and resilience, or 30,000 connections. And even though we don't grow neurons after a certain age, after age 5, we continuously make these connections. And these connections can be broken down with disease and environmental factors as well. And so those connections are the main reason why there's been a lot of research on brain resilience and cognitive resilience, which I will talk about. At any moment, the brain consumes about 20 to 25% of the body's energy. And for such a small organ, it's only about 3 pounds. It's only about 2% of the body's weight, but it continuously consumes 25% of the body's energy. So that gives us a window of all the processes and all of the metabolic needs of this needy, hungry organ. And whatever we do, whether it's certain medication given to us or our environment, it continuously affects that energy metabolism and the infrastructure of the brain. I guess we're out of batteries. But before we actually go and talk about the amazing function of the brain, it's very important for us to talk about the other end of the spectrum, which is the disease spectrum, dementia, which is the area that my research is focused on, and we see patients in our clinic. Now, dementia, as you may know, is the umbrella category. Dementia is defined as a condition where cognitive function is affected to an extent where people have difficulty doing their activities of daily living, whether it's doing their finances or driving or taking care of complicated, complex activities in life. And there are multiple types of dementias. Alzheimer's disease is the main type of dementia. About 60 to 70% of all dementias are Alzheimer's disease. And then we have vascular dementia, which is another 10 to 20%. And then Parkinson's dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal lobe dementia, which are smaller percentages. But we'll use the word Alzheimer's and dementia interchangeably in this talk, because that's the main type of dementia that we see on a regular basis. And the numbers are pretty scary. And the saddest thing is that every time I have to speak to faculty or to a community, we do a lot of community talks to different churches and community centers. Every time we do so, we have to change this slide because the numbers are growing. And then that's the scariest thing. Right now in the United States, we have about 5.8 million people who live with dementia. And a lot of scientists and a lot of epidemiologists think that this is an understatement. Thank you. Because it's not reported. It's, we still have communities where cognitive impairment and dementia are assumed to be a normal part of aging. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of community doctors who don't even use the term dementia. They call it senility, which is, an obscure term, and we don't use it anymore. And it is the third leading cause of death in the United States. It's usually touted as the fifth, but when you look at the mortality and the mortality rates, right now they're not coded appropriately. A lot of people who go into the hospital for falls or for pneumonias, they're listed under those conditions, but the underlying condition is dementia. And I'm afraid that it is soon going to be the #1 reason of mortality in the United States. It's the #1 reason of mortality in Japan and in the UK, and soon it'll be the same here as well. Now, as mortality from other diseases such as breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV are on the decline, the only disease that is rising, mortality is rising, is Alzheimer's disease. And in the last 15 years, mortalities have risen to 145%, which is an incredibly large number. 1 in 10 individuals over the age of 65 are suffering from Alzheimer's disease here in the United States. There's a gender disparity. Women tend to be at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to men. It's 1 in 6 for women compared to 1 in 11. And it has to do a lot with, obviously, the way women actually have, processing, they process fats and they process glucose differently. Vascular cognitive impairment and vascular risk factors affect women differently compared to men. We're still trying to understand better whether hormones, menopause, and pregnancy have an effect. There's no concrete evidence so far, but we're still trying to understand that better. There is also a hypothesis by someone in Rush University who did a research and found out that the women who are having cognitive impairment at this stage, when they look back at their lives, they were never involved in complex cognitive activities earlier in life. Most of the time men were, but women weren't. And so there is a theory that maybe, perhaps, cognitive resilience was not really built in women at that stage, and that's the population that we're seeing right now. But that's just a hypothesis. So there's a lot of interesting research going on to find out why is there a disparity between men and women, and it's not because of survival rate. It's not that fact. There are racial disparities as well. African Americans have 4 times higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to Caucasians, and it's 2.7 times higher among Hispanics. And again, it has nothing to do with genetics. Epidemiological studies have shown that it is all about access to information and access to resources, and the culture of understanding dementia and accepting the fact that it's not a part and parcel of aging. There are a lot of times when we go to different, African American churches, and you tend to see women mostly there in the leadership, and the men aren't. And the numbers are just incredibly crazy because, more than about 30% of individuals, male members of the church, have dementia, have vascular dementia of some sort, and so that increases their general mortality. And they don't seek help because it's assumed that that's just what happens when people get older. The cost is astronomical. The direct cost of Alzheimer's disease currently is $290 billion. And in comparison, if you look at the cost of heart disease, it's $100 billion. Cancers, all of cancers put together, the cost is about $60 billion. And so the numbers for Alzheimer's disease are exponentially higher. And this is just the direct cost. There's another $240 billion indirect cost, of people losing their jobs, spending time with their loved ones, caregiver support, that is not taken into consideration in this number. And it is assumed that this number is going to reach to 1.1 to $3 trillion by 2050 if we don't make a dent in the way Alzheimer's disease is growing in our communities. And by 2050, 16 million people will be suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So it's critical for all of us to have conversations about prevention, if not treatment, of this disease. And it has to start now. So there are a few myths. There are many myths, but I just chose the salient ones here to speak to you about, because I think this is the reason why we're slowed down. This is the reason why we're not making a difference. The first one is Alzheimer's disease cannot be prevented. That has changed, thank goodness. And I'll show you some of the slides from the Alzheimer's Association International Conference last year. Most healthcare providers feel that Alzheimer's disease cannot be prevented. And there were, papers after papers and statements after statements from the Alzheimer's Association, from the American Heart Association, stating that, once the disease starts, there's really nothing one can do about it. The other myth is Alzheimer's starts with the symptoms of forgetfulness, and that's not true. The process, the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease and dementia starts at least 20 to 30 years before manifestations of any symptoms. So you have those inflammatory conditions, the oxidative byproducts that accumulate in the brain and damages the infrastructure of the brain very, very early before any of the symptoms show themselves. The third myth is there will be only one medication treatment for Alzheimer's disease, and this one has slowed us down significantly. Everyone, every PhD and every neurology resident getting out of residency wants to get on the next grant from NIH to start damaging and getting rid of amyloid protein. Everybody and their uncle and cousin is focused on amyloid and tau tangles. We're zapping it with laser, we're melting it with acid, we're throwing medications at it, we're sprinkling blueberries at it, trying to do whatever we can to try to destroy that and find a treatment for it. And that is the worst approach. I think that has completely shut down the bigger picture. We're focusing on the end product, on the downstream effects of amyloid and tau. Yes, they are involved in the disease, but they are not the reason why individuals get dementia. That is not the reason why neurons are damaged. And so a lot of universities have started to realize that. And I don't know if you heard, but last year Pfizer, which is one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, they withdrew their entire team of Alzheimer's science and research because they realized that they were looking at the wrong model. And people who are involved in Alzheimer's research have now understood the fact that we can't only focus on the downstream effect. We have to go back and see what we were doing wrong. Were we catching individuals at a wrong time? Were we looking at the wrong population to begin with? Are we not looking at other processes at this point? Did I just turn this off? Oh, yeah, I did. Sorry. So thank goodness, I'm actually very optimistic today. This talk was very different 5 years ago. I had a little bit of anger in me, but thank goodness that has gone away because I think we're realizing that it's about time for us to look at the bigger picture. And the last one that I put here was, the fact that people feel that Alzheimer's disease is a purely genetic disease. Oh, my mother had it, my grandfather had it, and I'm bound to have it and I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to enjoy my life. I hear that all the time in the clinic. For me, I think I went into this field selfishly because I had two grandparents who had Alzheimer's disease. My grandfather, incredible human being. He was my hero. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon from Columbia University, and he had a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins. Highly educated individual, wonderful human being. And we saw how this disease slowly and gradually took parts of him, where he forgot his children's name, and then he forgot our names, and he would get scared of us when we would go in to help him out. And to see this incredible man slowly and gradually, become like a child was the most painful experience I have ever had. And my grandmother also had Alzheimer's disease, and I saw how it affected my parents. And so, having two individuals, actually three individuals who had Alzheimer's disease, I should definitely have the genes. I think I do have it. But I live my life as if, I do have the risk, but there's a lot that I can do to prevent it. And we have science that backs that up. So this is the reason why we've slowed down. These two proteins, we have the amyloid plaques, which are, fluffy proteins that are deposited between neurons. And then we have tau tangles, the hyperphosphorylated tau tangles, which are abnormal proteins that deposit inside neurons. So these proteins outside and inside, they start damaging the infrastructure of the brain, the neurons themselves, as well as the connections between these brain cells. And that's how the neurodegenerative process is promoted, and there's atrophy of the brain, and individuals end up having symptoms of cognitive impairment and dementia. So this is what well, not me, but this is what the world of dementia and neurology has been focused on all these years. And after billions and billions of dollars, after millions of grants given to multiple universities around the world, incredibly smart people looking at everything, we have zero treatment. We have no treatment whatsoever. Every medication that was tested was fine when it was tested on mice. Mice got better, but when it was tested in human beings, in multiple clinical trials, didn't make any difference. And I think one of the many things that we were doing wrong was you can't just, put a hole in a mouse brain and assume that that's Alzheimer's disease. You can't just, genetically modify mice and then start treating it, assuming that that would be the same thing as in human beings. Mice are not men. And so that is one of the reasons why we have to change our perspectives about treatment. Yeah, and we had almost 400 clinical trials to date that tested medication on human beings, and it was a complete failure. The medication that we have right now that are FDA approved, Aricept and Namenda, they're not disease-modifying medication. They only work for a certain period of time to ameliorate the symptoms of dementia. They basically stabilize memory or maybe improve it a little bit, only for about 6 months to a year, mostly to a year, and that's basically it. So it's a pretty devastating disease, and it's very depressing to see people coming in over and over again at a very late stage, and there's really nothing that we can do for them. Genes. Genes are not our destiny. It actually gives us a range of how the disease manifests itself. Scientists have done multiple, analyses of genetics. This one is called the GWAS, or the genome-wide analysis of the genes that are responsible for Alzheimer's disease. And as you can see, it's not one gene, it's not two genes, it's actually a polygenetic disease. The number of individuals, or the percentage of individuals with Alzheimer's disease that have a purely genetic background is, can someone guess? What's the percentage of Alzheimer's patients that are purely genetic? Well, close, yes, 3%. 3% of all Alzheimer's disease are purely genetic. And these genes are represented right here in the top left corner. Presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein, APP. If individuals have presenilin 1 or presenilin 2, they're bound to get Alzheimer's disease very early. But we don't see that often. Like I said, it's only 3%. There are very small places around the world, especially in Southern American countries, where you go into a village where, the father has it, the daughter has it, the brother has it, and then you see clusters of these diseases in communities. But, in the United States and in the rest of the world, you don't see those kind of purely genetic models. The next one that we always hear about is the ApoE4. Has anybody heard of the ApoE4 gene? Yes. So the ApoE4 can be heterozygous or homozygous. So depending on the number of alleles you get from your parents, if you get one ApoE4 allele, your chances of dementia goes up by 5%, 5 times. So you have 5 times higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease if you have one. If you have 2 copies, then the chances go up to 15 to 20 times. But guess what? 50% of the population who have even 2 copies of those alleles never develop Alzheimer's disease. Why? It's because of the lifestyle and environmental risk factors for them. The rest of the genes, these ADAM10 or the PLED3, the TREM2, these are genes that are responsible for various functions in our body, such as endocytosis, getting rid of waste products, getting rid of inflammation, getting rid of oxidative byproducts in our brain, getting rid of all of the cytoskeletal debris that is accumulated. Remember, the brain is a very active organ. Working constantly, never sleeping, using 25% of the body's energy. You can imagine the amount of byproducts that is created in a day. So if there's something wrong with those genes, or if our body is actually overwhelmed, if our brain is overwhelmed, they stop working properly. So the answer is, most of these tend to be related to what we do on a regular basis, our lifestyle. Even ApoE4, it's actually a lipid regulating gene, which essentially means it helps the process of transferring lipid from the membrane of the cell, from one cell to another, from inside the cell to outside the cell. And if we have dysfunctional ApoE4, it means we have to be wary of our fat consumption, of being aware of our cholesterol levels, and things of that nature. And that's why a lot of studies have actually shown that people who have vascular risk factors, they tend to have higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. So if anybody asks us, I have the genes, we have to tell them, well, that really doesn't matter because it's a polygenetic disease. And only people who have early onset dementia, that's where you see a purely genetic manifestation of the disease. Let me tell you about the APP, amyloid precursor protein. So amyloid precursor protein is very high in Down syndrome individuals. And if you recall from some of the studies that were done on these individuals who have Down syndrome, they usually tend to have higher risk of developing dementia of Alzheimer's type early on. After age 40, their risk actually goes up. And one of the studies that we're doing right now based on a database showed that when Down syndrome individuals have good control of their vascular risk factors, say for example, if they have diabetes and they have better controlled diabetes, if they have well-controlled cholesterol levels, if they have well-controlled blood pressure, and if they don't get overweight during their midlife, they actually are able to push dementia significantly. They don't develop dementia earlier on. That's the significance of the vascular risk factors on this disease. So we say, and now thank goodness, Alzheimer's Association says that prevention is the new treatment. With no medication available, with a different perspective of the disease process, of how it starts and where we catch it in the disease process, and the immense amount of information we have from studies on diet and exercise and stress and sleep, this is the statement. So last year, Dean and I went to the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, and I have to be honest, it gets very boring after a while. You're there with incredibly intelligent people, but it's about molecule after molecule on mice after mice and animal studies, and perhaps some few imaging studies here and there. And at the end of the very posh conference, we really don't have any options. Yes, there was good work done, but not a lot of progress. But last year, the first session of the plenary program, where all 5,000 individuals were there in Chicago, the first talk was by Dr. Mia Kivipalto. She is the PI of one of the larger studies, the finger study in Finland. She came in and she presented this slide. The whole theme of the conference started with the prevention is the new cure. And I don't recall ever giving Dean high fives during a conference, but we were so happy because finally, we are here and we're realizing that it's more complex. So wanted to kind of go over some of the studies that were presented at last year's conference. Like this one, this was actually a statement that came out in Scientific American Journal. Alzheimer's meeting, lifestyle factors are the best and only bet now for reducing dementia risk. And let me show you some of the papers that pointed to this statement, like this one. Can dementia risk due to genes be counteracted by adherence to a healthy lifestyle? Again, concern about genes. So let's see what this said. So this study was done on a large UK biobank on about 157,000 individuals who were older than 60 years of age. They were followed for a median of 6 years, and about 668 dementia cases were identified. And they found out that individuals who had high genetic risk, probably a combination of ApoE4 with some other genes, their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease went up by 60%. But guess what? If the same kind of genetic risk factor was seen with unhealthy lifestyle, the risk went up by 360%. That's the effect of lifestyle on the genetic picture. And then in different modeling and on seeing a different set of population, they found out that when individuals have high genetic risk, but they actually had a very healthy lifestyle, they reduced their risk by less than 30%. And so the statement was, yes, adherence to a healthy lifestyle can offset genetic risk. So we don't have to worry about the genes that we have from our parents or grandparents. It does not determine Alzheimer's disease. Here's another paper. So this one was done by an individual at Columbia University, from where I come from. They wanted to find out to what extent does the combination of lifestyle factors reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease. You know, you always have an individual who says, I can't change my diet, I can't exercise, but I'm going to stop smoking, or maybe I will walk around the neighborhood once in a while. So how much of lifestyle do we have to adhere to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's? This was my favorite study. So they looked at two databases, the Chicago Health and Aging Project and the Rush Memory and Aging Project. So they combined these two populations, and they were followed for about 9.1 years. So it was a retrospective data analysis. And they created a healthy lifestyle score. The healthy lifestyle score looked at the MIND diet. Does anybody know what the MIND diet is? MIND diet is a combination of Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet, dietary approach to stop hypertension. So a mostly plant-based Mediterranean diet with low salt consumption. Exercise was defined as exercising more than 150 minutes per week, moderate to vigorous, so it's not just a walk around the neighborhood. Smoking cessation, focusing on behavioral modification, minimizing alcohol, not really, asking people to drink wine, because now we know that no amount of alcohol is actually good for the brain. So focusing on minimizing alcohol, and cognitive engagement, which was defined as mental and social engagement, something that you guys are doing right now. And they found out that compared to individuals who adhere to maybe one of these healthy lifestyle risk factors to none, people who adhere to 2 or 3 of these healthy lifestyle factors reduce their risk by 39%. And people who adhere to 4 to 5 of them reduce their risk by 60%. So 60% of Alzheimer's disease risk can be avoided if individuals adhere to a healthy lifestyle. This is new. This is coming from an association that kept telling us 5 years ago that there is no prevention of dementia, that there is nothing that can be done for individuals to prevent cognitive impairment. This is huge. It was great news for all of us. So the way Dean and I have looked at it together, and this is actually from our book, The Alzheimer's Solution, there are several different processes that are involved in the development or the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease, but the main ones are 4. Inflammation, oxidation or development of oxidative reactive oxygen species that destroy the neurons and its connections, lipid dysregulation, which has to do with cholesterol metabolism, and glucose or energy metabolism or dysregulation, which has to do a lot with insulin resistance in the brain and development of prediabetes and its effect on cognitive state. And these processes are governed by our daily risk factors, the foods that we eat, the kind of exercises or movements that we are involved in, sleep patterns, head trauma, infections, blood pressure, other vascular risk factors. And so, it seems a bit magical initially when you say the word inflammation and oxidation. It seems obscure, but it actually is related to lifestyle. And so what are some of the things that we can do that has been shown to affect these 4 pathways are nutrition, exercise, unwind or stress management. Stress has to do a lot with brain health, and we'll talk about that in detail. Restore or restorative sleep, not the kind of sleep where you're knocked out by trazodone or some other medication, but the kind of sleep that allows us to go through each and every stage of deep sleep, because that's when the brain consolidates its memories, and that's when the brain cleanses itself. That's where the microglia get activated. We'll talk about that. And the 5th one is optimizing cognitive activity, improving cognitive reserve and resilience, which is a concept that has been studied for many years, specifically by Dr. Stern in Columbia University. That's the reserve that we build during life. And so we created this self-serving acronym, NEURO, being neurologists. N is for nutrition, E is for exercise, U is for unwind, R is for restorative sleep, and O is for optimizing cognitive activity. So the application of neuro to prevent dementia and Alzheimer's disease is incredibly important. And so because we have a lot of time, although I'm not in agreement, 2 hours is too long for a talk. I think we all have to stand up and probably stretch a little bit in between. But I wanted to go over some of the research that has been done in this field and not spend too much time, but show you some really salient papers that have shown us the effect of these lifestyle risk factors on brain health. We'll start with N, nutrition. Now, I'm very passionate about nutrition, and you were saying earlier, as a vascular neurology fellow at Columbia University, I'd round in the morning at the ICU with my attendings and see patients in the ICU and then in the stroke wards. And as you may know, when somebody comes in with a stroke, they come with sudden onset neurological deficits, whether it's blindness or paralysis or inability to speak. And it's devastating because it's sudden, and most of them don't make it on time. So TPA or tissue plasminogen activator, the clot busting medication, is not given on time. And so most of these individuals end up having permanent neurological deficits. And the only thing that we could potentially do for them was to make sure that they don't have another stroke. And at the end of the day, after thousands of dollars of MRIs and CT angiograms and mechanical retrievers to see if we could get rid of the clot, multiple days of stay at the ICU, at the hospital, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, cognitive therapy, and all we did was send them home with an aspirin and a statin, and that's it. And it happened over and over and over again, day after day after day. And thank goodness I was from Loma Linda with the concept of preventive medicine and preventive neurology going into Columbia University. I convinced my mentors and my professors to allow me to study epidemiology of stroke and prevention of stroke. So I got involved in studying prevention of stroke, and I did a lot of my work there, and I published a few papers. And I found out that 90% of strokes and 90% of cognitive impairment as a result of stroke can be prevented. And you know what the most important factor was? Food. Food was the most important factor because food determined our cholesterol levels. Food determined our glucose regulation and how it manifested into disease. And food determined what kind of nutrients we were introducing into our body. And so, I printed out a whole lot of pamphlets and paper from the Adventist Health Study, and I had my own stack in my clinic room, and I would give it out to patients. But then I realized that, information is important, but people are never going to change if the food is not delicious. It really was as simple as that. And so I started collecting some recipes, and my passion for nutrition grew to the point where I wanted to learn how to cook. So I would be in the ICU in my scrubs, seeing patients in the morning, And then at 7 p.m. I would take the train downtown, and in 2 years I went and I got my culinary degree. And so I created my own recipes, and I would have bread. Thank you. It was probably one of the best things I've ever done. It was so much fun too, you go there with your scrubs and you're all nervous and you're excited, and then you're cutting onions and potatoes. It's almost like meditation, where you're not talking to anyone and you're just focusing on how you're cutting onions, and you're doing it wrong, and you have to do another one and another one until you get better at it. It was amazing. And so I set up brain health workshops. I would have 15 or 20 of my patients come in, and I would just cook for them. And I would show them how to avoid cheese, or how to, avoid butter, and how to incorporate more greens. Greens can be delicious. You hate kale? That's okay. We'll make it delicious for you. So it became a passion. And so I got involved in the Northern Manhattan Study, which is one of the largest databases at Columbia University. I looked at dietary patterns among Hispanics in the Northern Manhattan Study. And right now I'm working with the California Teacher Study, which is one of the largest studies that has been going on since 1995. And I look at dietary patterns and brain diseases. So just kind of giving you a little bit of a background. So I'm passionate about nutrition. And we know from multiple studies that there are certain things that promote that inflammation and oxidation that we talk about. It's the cholesterol level, it's the sugar levels, and it's the amount of processed foods that people are exposed to. And so we want to change that into a more whole food, more plant-based diet, because that has been proven to be the healthiest dietary pattern for brain health, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's and stroke prevention. Now, when you look at the neurovascular unit, everybody talks about brain cells, and we live in an age where, Twitter and YouTubers actually give a lot of health information to people, and most people listen to Dr. Oz and not really listen to their doctors or nutritionists. But, sadly, most of the doctors not really trained well in nutrition. But when you look at the brain is the most vascular organ in the body. I read a statistic, a number, a couple of days ago in one of the papers. I forgot to actually put it up here, but they actually measured the amount of brain vessels, or the arteries that we have in our cerebral cortex. And they said that if you put all the arteries end to end, it would span 400 miles, which is incredible. So all these small arteries, they're surrounded by neurons. And we have a very tight barrier called the blood-brain barrier that is impervious to, microbes, to chemicals. And this gets damaged over time. So no matter what we do, I think the most important thing is to address vascular health of the brain. That is not usually addressed when it comes to the concept of Alzheimer's disease. And now more and more individuals and more scientists are looking at Alzheimer's disease in the context of vascular impairment in the brain. And so it's a combination of multiple things that actually ends up in neuronal dysfunction manifesting in dementia. We have genetic factors, we have vascular factors, the environmental factors, and all of these are essentially affected by the kind of lifestyle we have, and that causes damage to the small arterioles and the brain capillaries, and the dysregulation of cerebral blood flow, the dysregulation of the metabolism of lipid and glucose in our brain ends up causing inflammation and oxidation, and ultimately dementia. So it's important for us to look at vascular risk factors and how food actually affects these risk factors. As far as dietary fat and Alzheimer's disease is concerned, it's important for us to talk about that most, because there is a great deal of confusion about fat intake and brain health. You have individuals and even doctors and scientists who say, don't worry about saturated fats. It doesn't really damage brain cells. It doesn't cause any harm. The brain is about 70% fat. You have to take fat. And I think they forget that fat actually has to traverse so much of endothelium in our vasculature to get to the brain, and that it's going to damage the vasculature and end up in vascular cognitive impairment. From one of the latest studies by Dr. Martha Morris in 2004, this was a very comprehensive, beautiful review on all of the studies that have been done on fat consumption and brain health. Matter of fact, I'm working with her right now to renew and add more papers to that systematic review. We know that cholesterol, it plays a very important role in Alzheimer's disease pathology. So cholesterol levels, especially during midlife, is incredibly important to address. People who have high blood cholesterol increase their risk of late onset Alzheimer's disease. Consumption of saturated fats, which are derived mostly from animal products such as butter and meat and cheese and dairy, and even coconut oil, which is 90% saturated fat, it increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Trans fats that are found in processed foods, obviously anything that's boxed that can stay on the shelf for years without looking bad, increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And on the contrary, they've looked at different populations, especially in the Mediterranean areas. When people consume poly and monounsaturated fats that are derived from nuts and seeds and avocados and extra virgin olive oil, they actually have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So it's not fat. Fat is not bad. It's the type of fat that matters. And we know that plant fats, poly and monounsaturated fats, are protective, while saturated fats and trans fatty acids are very harmful. Here's a study that was done in 2002. I really like the study. This was done by Dr. Mia Kivipelto from Finland. She looked at 1,449 individuals who were 65 to 79 years of age. And these individuals were identified to have ApoE4, which is one of the risk factors, genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. She found out that if they had ApoE4, their risk went up by twofold. But if these individuals had elevated midlife cholesterol, their risk went up by 3 times. And if they had high blood pressure, their risk went up by 2.5 times. And if they had a combination of cholesterol and high blood pressure, which we usually see, it's a trifecta usually, high cholesterol, blood pressure, and diabetes, their risk went up exponentially, which supports the theory of cholesterol. The Chicago Health and Aging Project, again, Dr. Morris in 2003, this was a longitudinal study. They looked at 2,500 individuals, and she found out that people who consumed higher amounts of saturated fats and trans fatty acids over 6 years period, they had a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But then compared to individuals who had lower consumption of saturated fats and who derived most of their fats from plants, poly and monounsaturated fats, they actually had a lower risk. And there was a follow-up study from this. She went ahead and she looked at neuropsychological scores, so memory testing, and she looked at their MRIs as well. They actually had better brain function and better looking brains. They had less vascular damage to the brain too. This is from Dr. Paul Guillaume from the Adventist Health Study back in 1993. Yes?
It's me.
Dr. Guillaume. It's good to meet you. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm starstruck. I need to talk to you later. Okay. Dr. Guillaume, it's lovely to have you here. Back in 1993, you told us that you published a paper on the incidence of dementia and the intake of animal products, and you showed us that people, I'm getting starstruck here, in about 300 individuals, people who consumed meat, including poultry and fish, which are sources of saturated fats, had twice the risk of developing dementia compared to vegetarians. And I think this has been one of the most important papers wherever we go, because promoting the concept of lowering cholesterol and lowering processed foods and increasing plant-based diet, this is the crucial paper that actually puts everything into perspective. I have to talk to you. My goodness, I am so happy you're here. So that was the paper. And after this, multiple other papers from different universities and from different populations came as well. This one is the most recent one in 2009 by Dr. Solomon. He's a good friend. In Kaiser Permanente Northern California group, he looked at about 10,000 individuals, 9,900 patients. And he found out, it was cross-sectional, that people who had high cholesterol levels during their midlife had a 57% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later on. So, this actually pushes us neurologists and us neuroscientists more and more to understand that it's not about that tau tangles and amyloid proteins only. You have to widen your scope. You have to look at the upstream processes that cause damage to the brain, that end up causing accumulation of amyloid and tau proteins. And Even borderline high cholesterol increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 23%. So we take that very seriously. If somebody comes into the clinic, if they have borderline and high cholesterol, we don't let them go. We have to address it. We have to lower it. And we're very stringent and very serious about lowering cholesterol. And it has to be with a combination of diet as well as medication. A lot of individuals can't just do it with diet. And that's why I'm a proponent of statins if I need to. Another study, women's health study from Harvard University in 2002. 6,000 women were followed for over 4 years. Higher saturated fat intake was associated with a poor trajectory of cognition. So they had a faster decline in their cognition compared to women who had the lowest intake in saturated fatty acids. And when they looked at neuropsychological scores, the women with the lowest saturated fat intake had the brain function of women 6 years younger. And MRI studies actually showed a bigger, larger brain with less atrophy and vascular disease in it too. So you see the variation in the same theme, don't we? And I could probably present to you like 30 or 40 different papers talking about the same concept of how important it is to address vascular risk factors in the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. This is one of the projects that I was involved in at Columbia University. So we looked at participants who ate a plant-based diet in that population. We looked at food frequency questionnaires and highlighted people who completely avoided meat for certain reasons. And we found out that they actually had a lower risk of cognitive impairment and cognitive decline, specifically vascular dementia, over a span of 6 years, compared to those who ate a standard American diet. Rush University Memory and Aging Project, they are leading a lot of the nutrition research on Alzheimer's disease. Again, Dr. Morris, back in 2015, she looked at 1,000 people, ages 58 to 98, and she was the one who created the MIND diet score. So the MIND diet is a dietary pattern that is Mediterranean, and it combines some of the elements of the DASH diet, which means lower sodium, more plants, no processed foods, very little meat. If at all meat, then it's fish, but it's mostly a plant-based diet. And she found out that people who adhered to the MIND diet, they reduced their risk of Alzheimer's disease by 53%. 53%, people. This is a disease we're talking about that has no treatment. And if we're able to reduce the risk by 53%, that's incredible. And honestly, when you look at the supplemental material of these studies, it's a basically washed down version of what the optimal diet is. So I think we can even do better. And we say you can prevent 90% of Alzheimer's disease if you do lifestyle right. Well, look at the wonderful numbers. And the good news was it's not an all or none phenomenon. Even moderate adherence to the diet reduced the risk by 35%, which is incredible. And participants who had high adherence to the diet had the cognitive functioning equivalent to a person who was 7.5 years younger. So better food, better brain, younger brain. Again, in the Adventist Health Study, Dina and I actually looked at the California Verbal Learning Test. It's a type of a neuropsychological test that looks at verbal learning, speed of processing, and we found out that in this population, a plant-based diet lowered the risk of vascular dementia by 28%. We're still in the process of publishing that, but that was an incredible revelation. Now, I work with the California Teacher Study, like I said earlier, 133,479 female public teachers and administrators that were followed since 1995. So we have a lot of information from them. We have food frequency questionnaires. We have questionnaires about their exercise patterns and stress patterns and hormone intake and all other risk factors that can affect vascular health and cognition. And so what I did was I linked the database to California Cancer Registry and the California Hospital database, and I wanted to look at the risk of stroke among these women and wanted to parse out the concept of Mediterranean diet, because every time someone says Mediterranean diet, we think it's probably, a lady sitting on a gondola eating some cheese and wine and pasta with a little bit of music in the background. And every time you open up Time magazine or the news, the concept of Mediterranean diet is completely skewed. So I wanted to see what makes this Mediterranean diet score? And here it is. Individuals get a high score if they consume vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, beans and lentils, and higher ratio of polyunsaturated fats to saturated fats. So meaning more fats from plants compared to animal products. And you get a low score if you eat meat, poultry, and dairy. So that's almost a vegetarian, whole food, plant-based diet, isn't it? So Dr. Guim, we're talking about the same thing. And obviously these are sources of saturated fats. So when I did an analysis to find out the hazard ratios of adherence to the Mediterranean diet and stroke, I found a stepwise decline in the risk of stroke as people consumed more and more of this dietary pattern. And it went down to about 44% lower risk of developing total strokes. Both ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic strokes, and total strokes were increased. Again, incredible. And this is just diet. We adjusted for other risk factors like exercise, hormone intake, stress, education, socioeconomic status, everything that changes or is a confounding variable in the formula. So that was the studies. Now, as far as supplements are concerned, unfortunately, we live in a society where everyone is looking for a quick fix. I know that some of you might see patients, but I have a plastic bag sign in my clinic. If I see someone coming in with a plastic bag, I know they have a lot of supplements with them. And they come in with 30 or 40 different kind of supplements, and we just spread them on the table, and I go through all of them, and 99% of them are useless, and they are in some sort of a subscription program, paying $300 and $500, thousands of dollars every month because they want to get things like, ashwagandha for brain health. But as far as clinical trials are concerned, and as far as information about supplement is concerned, we know that there is no supplement that can prevent cognitive decline or dementia. That vitamins should be taken in deficiency states. If someone is deficient in vitamin B12 or D or anything of that nature, it needs to be replaced. But studies haven't really shown any good outcomes in people who have optimal levels. And I wanted to go over one of the most prominent studies that was done to look at the effect of vitamins, specifically B vitamins, on cognition, and it was the VitaCog study. The VitaCog study, which was conducted in 2014, looked at the effect of B vitamin consumption in people who had mild cognitive impairment, which is the early stages of cognitive impairment. And they found out that regardless of what the B vitamin levels were, if the homocysteine level was high, B vitamins seemed to help. So high homocysteine was actually a risk factor for cognitive impairment, which is an inflammatory marker. And in this study, high-dose B vitamins, which included folic acid, B6, and B12, were given to patients with mild cognitive impairment for 2 years. They saw a 30% reduction in brain atrophy in the B vitamin group compared to placebos. And in patients who had a homocysteine level in the upper quartile, which was very high, the atrophy rate was actually reduced by 53%. So it's important to address that high homocysteine and inflammation. And memory decline was almost halted in the treatment group. And that's why it's important to check homocysteine levels and vitamin levels on a regular basis in people who are high risk. So the conclusion was, in patients with elevated homocysteine and mild cognitive impairment, treatment with B vitamins significantly reduced the risk of dementia. Another paper that came out in 2010 showed us that it's not just one vitamin or the other, that it's actually the synergy between vitamins that is very, very important. So they wanted to look at omega-3 fatty acids specifically. Now, omega-3 fatty acids are found in fish, but they can also be found in plant sources, as in ALA, like chia seeds and chia seeds and flax seeds. And they found out that the concentration of DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, is lower in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease compared to age-matched controls. And regardless of what the levels of DHA was in their blood, if their B levels were low, DHA consumption didn't really make any difference, and it was the combination of the two that was very important, which kind of gives us a window into the idea of synergy, that it's the synergy between the micronutrients that determines optimal brain health. And how do you create synergy? By eating food, by getting our nutrients from food, because our body recognizes them very well. They're more bioavailable. So expanding, our culinary plate or palate by including more vegetables, by fruits, by including more seeds and nuts, that's the way you can increase the micronutrient content of food, and not just by relying on pills and vitamins. This is the paper that we published, Dean and I published in 2017, I believe. Yes, 2018. It came out in 2018. And we looked at insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance in the brain is a state where brain cells have a hard time using glucose as a fuel molecule. We all know that the unit fuel is actually glucose. It's not fat, it's glucose. And when people have insulin resistance due to inflammation and oxidative byproducts, brain insulin resistance can reduce cognitive health. And in this population, in the enhanced population, which was very, very large, we found that people who had insulin resistance had lower cognitive state. So regardless of whether someone has diabetes or not, even pre-diabetes or some markers of insulin resistance can be a risk factor for the development of Alzheimer's disease. So that was nutrition. And the summary is diets that are made from whole, unprocessed, mostly plant foods are the best diets for the brain, whether it's for Alzheimer's prevention or stroke prevention, and even for Parkinson's prevention. Hopefully maybe next year we can talk about Parkinson's disease and the effect of insulin resistance on Parkinson's dementia. But now we know that we can actually prevent 80 to 90% of these diseases in our lifetime. Saturated fats are associated with insulin resistance and inflammation in the brain. And vitamin and nutrients are best derived from foods and not supplements. There are certain supplements like vitamin B12 which needs to be taken if somebody is taking only a plant-based diet, because we don't get it from plants. But other than that, there's no other multivitamin that seems to be necessary, and we can get it from foods. Let's talk about exercise now. I think we have a little bit of time. It's funny that there's really no argument about whether exercise is good or not. But when you talk about food, there's people fighting over paleo diet and keto diet and this diet and that diet. Well, we know why. There's really no money to be made in exercise, I suppose. But we've known for a very long time that exercise is incredibly important for health in general, but for brain, it's incredible. From the Framingham longitudinal study, this one was published in 2010, just a daily brisk walk, especially in the morning because we're exposed to the sun, can reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 40%. Just a daily brisk walk, which actually tells you about the importance of incorporating this on a daily basis. This was a very interesting analysis, a meta-analysis, which is the most painful study ever, because you have to get studies from everybody else and put it together. 15 studies, nearly 34,000 individuals, found that high level of physical activity reduced cognitive decline by 38%, and even moderate physical activity reduced it by 35%. Now, the focus is not on the percentage. The focus is essentially on the level of activity or the intensity. There was a time when people, when scientists would say, okay, any level of activity is good for you, but we know that now it has to be strenuous. And we don't necessarily have to measure our heart rates. I think the main thing that we tell our patient is you have to get tired. 30 minutes of tiring exercise where you have a difficulty finishing a sentence and you break a sweat is incredibly important, and it can reduce risk of dementia. And in this particular study, they found out that people who engaged in less intensive studies, more moderate form of exercise, they still benefited from it, but not as much. I guess 38 versus 35% is not much of a difference, but now we know that it has to be intense. This is probably my favorite study. This was in 2016 by Dr. Mavros. He looked at resistance training. We all talk about cardio, but when it comes to resistance training and weight training, there wasn't much information until now. So he looked at resistance training in a group of adults who already had mild cognitive impairment. Now, mild cognitive impairment is the pre-Alzheimer's states. So people do have memory problems, but they can take care of their activities of daily living. And they were put in this program to exercise 2 to 3 times a week for 6 months. And guess what? 47% of these individuals who had mild cognitive impairment, they reversed their disease. They reversed their scores. They got better. They got normal again. And they stayed, quote unquote, normal, meaning normal neuropsychological scores 18 months after the study ended too. That was the impact of the resistance training. And they also found out that people who had the most buildup in their leg muscles, girth in their muscles, when their muscle mass grew, they actually had the biggest hippocampi as well. So bigger legs, bigger brain, can I say that? Is that okay if I say that? And it makes sense. When we exercise, there is a hormone called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that is secreted. It just skyrockets as soon as somebody starts exercising. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor is responsible for making neuronal connections. And these neuronal connections, they translate into better brain health and reduction of cognitive decline. So, for summary, exercise, specifically strenuous or even moderate exercise, can grow the brain and it can reduce the risk of cognitive impairment. Sedentary behavior nullifies any activity that we do. And that's why I'm scared of you guys sitting here for such a long time today, because we would be exercising 30 minutes a day, but then if we're sitting behind our desks for say 4, 6, 8 hours, it completely nullifies the benefit of that brain, and we have evidence for that. So standing up, moving around, stretching every hour is key. And then leg strength is actually associated with a bigger hippocampus and a bigger brain. And the idea that it's about muscle training and muscle strength building is also very, very important. Let's talk about stress. I put a gentleman's picture here because stress is always associated with women, and I was like, no, men also get stressed. So let's talk about the importance of stress management. Now, there was a time when stress was pushed aside, and it was usually said that people have to control themselves and stress doesn't have to do anything with anything. But now we know that people who have chronic stress, which is nothing but worrying on a daily basis, just worrying about small things over and over again and not finding time to get rid of those worries, not finding time to completely get rid of that noise in our minds, they have a higher risk for brain atrophy. In this study, there was a 14% reduction in the volume of hippocampus in people who had chronic stress. And when we're under stress, there is an abnormality in the amount of cortisol, adrenaline, and other stress hormones in our bodies. And we know that cortisol is actually damaging to the hippocampus. So our hippocampus are 2 small areas in our brain that are responsible for encoding memory. And they're very, very sensitive, but they're very resilient too. You can make a lot of connections if you build your leg muscles, but any amount of cortisol or adrenaline or lack of sleep damages that hippocampus, which is the center of memory consolidation. And in studies, in volumetric MRI studies, we know that there's shrinkage of the hippocampus in people who have high stress, people who have been exposed to bad families, childhood abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse. All of that have been associated with smaller hippocampi and increased risk of cognitive impairment later on in life. In this study, so they looked at, activities that reduce stress. So in UCLA, they looked at meditation. Meditation actually increases the risk, the volume of the hippocampus. It decreases the risk for cognitive impairment. So they put a couple of meditators, people who were able to calm themselves down and get rid of stresses in their minds inside an MRI machine, and they looked at the volume of their hippocampus, and compared to non-meditators, they actually had bigger hippocampi. And so it's all about perception of stress. There have been studies that have looked at populations where they were given a task. So say, for example, there are 2 populations, they're given the same task. One population was told that this is a very stressful time for you. This task is incredibly difficult. It's going to be hard for you, but try to do it as much as you can. The same task was given to the other population, but it was presented in a different way. It was defined in a different way. The other population was told that this is a hard task, but you're going to be able to do it. It's not difficult at all. Your body is going to prepare itself to take on this challenge, and at the end of it, you will feel great. So the only difference was labeling. The only difference was definition. How did you define one task to one population versus the other? And they checked their blood pressure, they checked inflammatory markers, and they checked some markers of, like sweat and physical markers of stress, sleep damage, and things like that. And after the end of the study, they found out that people who had the negative perception about the task, they had higher blood pressures, they had more vascular constriction, which actually promotes high blood pressure and promotes less blood flow to the brain. They had more inflammatory markers, their sleep got worse, and their sense of self-worth was actually plummeting. But when they looked at the other population that had the good definition, where they thought that all of these bodily changes that they were feeling, the tremors in their hands, the dry mouth, the anxiety, just like me walking in here and speaking to you guys, that feeling was just a way of my body preparing itself to grow. That was me getting ready to take on this challenge and growing my brain and to kind of, putting a positive spin to it. They had lower blood pressure, they had lower inflammatory markers, they had no blood vessel constriction, they slept well, and guess what? They wanted to do it again, which was interesting. The others just wanted to go take a vacation. So it's all about perception of stress. We know that good stress, the kind of stress that grows the mind, boosts new cell connections, speeds up our learning system. It creates brain resilience, the kind of protection that we need to avoid Alzheimer's disease, and it sharpens our memories. And then bad stress, the kind of stress that we have no control over, that we defined it in a negative way, it damages hippocampal cells. There's hippocampal atrophy, there's amygdala atrophy and frontal lobe atrophy, impaired learning. People tend to have lower scores in exams when they have bad stress. It causes blood vessel constriction and damage to it ultimately, and obviously impairs motivation and energy levels as well. So it's all about perception of stress, and that's why there's a lot of focus on making sure that people are equipped with resources and behavioral activities that can help them modify bad stress into good stress. All right, let's talk about sleep. We don't sleep like that, but I thought that was a very cute baby. We know that sleep deprivation harms our brain, but we didn't know how much, and we're getting a lot of great information now. There's two functions of the brain. There are two things that happens to our brain when we sleep. The first thing that happens is our memories are consolidated. So when we get information throughout the day, it's like scribbles on a notepad or on a sticky note everywhere. That's our information we get. When we sleep, this scribbled note gets typed into a beautiful Word document, and it's placed in a file and a folder and a cabinet so that we can retrieve it the next day. It's easier for us to know where it is. But when we don't sleep, those sticky notes, they get scrambled. You pour tea or water on it, and you can't read it anymore, and that's why all of our memories are scrambled the next day if we don't get enough sleep. The second function of sleep is cleansing of the brain. We have these cells called the microglia. The microglia are the brain's specialized cells to clean the brain. They're essentially the janitor cells of the brain. And they get activated when we go into the deep stages of sleep. And what they do is they start getting rid of the oxidative byproducts during sleep, and so our brain is able to function better in the next day. Now, these microglia are a little finicky. If we don't sleep, instead of getting rid of the byproducts, they start eating away at the brain. They start eating away at the neurons, the neuronal connections, and they found out that people who have chronic sleep deprivation actually have smaller brains. Even one night of sleep deprivation can damage the brain. So, they've done studies where they check amyloid protein, which is a byproduct, again, in the cerebrospinal fluid. One night of sleep deprivation can actually increase the amount of amyloid in the brain, and it doesn't get extruded into the system. Our brain is not able to get rid of it properly. So sorry, we can't make it up during the weekends. And the damage is cumulative over time, and that's why this actually explains brain shrinkage in people who have chronic sleep deprivation. The other thing that is very, very interesting is the effect of sleep apnea on brain health, and specifically in the risk of development of Alzheimer's disease. They did a study in 2015 in University of Florida, and they found out that, this was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, 13,000 participants, they found that untreated sleep apnea increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 70%. 70%. So we'd be eating all the sweet potatoes and spinach in the world, but if we have untreated sleep apnea, it's definitely damaging. And it makes sense with the lowering of oxygen saturation in the blood, with the vascular damage to the brain. It can actually promote the deposition of amyloid and damage to the blood vessels and the brain itself. So as far as summary is concerned, sleep apnea increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 70%. Sleep is important for cleansing the brain and for memory consolidation. And medication is not the answer. True, there are times when we have to rely on medication because we have to quickly fix some behaviors and help individuals get some rest. But over time, it's all about cognitive behavioral therapy and addressing sleep hygiene. So things like environment and food and sleep patterns, getting rid of worrying, getting rid of stress right before sleep. And it's not something that can be done in a short period of time. It's probably the most difficult thing, and it takes the longest as well. But that's the key for better brain health. All right, we're reaching the last aspect of brain health, which is optimization of cognitive activity. Now, we know that the connections between the brains, the ones that I was talking to you about, each brain cell can have as little as 2 connections or as many as 30,000 connections. These connections confer protection. These synaptic connections are made and broken on a regular basis. The concept of cognitive reserve was defined by Dr. Stern back in 2002. And he's a scientist, a neurologist in Columbia University that looked at different populations who had very complex and challenging lives. So say, for example, a CEO of a company, or, Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Airlines, or, a doctor who sees a lot of patients, or, a mother who has 3 different jobs and is raising children. And he found out that people who have complex cognitive lives are very well protected, regardless of their vascular risk factors. And so we coined the term idea density. Idea density means how much does an individual come up with new ideas and new thoughts? How much do we challenge ourselves on a regular basis? And that seems to be very protective. Anybody heard of the London taxi driver study? It's a very interesting study. So in London, they wanted to look at the brains of taxi drivers after they took a gruesome test. I don't know if you guys have been to London. I think you probably have. But it's no Chicago. It's no New York. The streets are a disaster. It's like a kid just took some yarn and just, glued it on a piece of paper. So back in the days when nobody had GPS, taxi drivers had to go through a very, very difficult test. It took them years to memorize each street, each house, each neighborhood. And so they were given books and textbooks, and they had to go through this training. And the neurologists were wondering, well, this is a great opportunity for us to see a before and after of their brains after they go through this test. And they compared them to bus drivers who basically had the same route. They would start one place, end up in another one, and get back. So there was no memorization involved, and they got their license very easily. And what they found out that taxi drivers who passed the test, by the way, and their pass rate was really low, it was 50%. Basically, they consistently had a larger hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that I was telling you about that consolidates memory. Their hippocampus was larger. And these weren't individuals in their 20s and 30s. They were 50 plus. They were 50 to 75 years of age. So even at that age, they were able to grow their hippocampus. And I think that's such a wonderful, wonderful news for all of us. And it's so empowering. And they found that more complex navigation, going around this city, led to more complex space knowledge, which in turn led to a bigger, more resilient brain. And that's why cognitive activity or optimizing cognitive activity is so important. Anybody knows about the Nun Study? Yes, the Nun Study. So the autobiography of Nun studies were taken, and this was a study that was done in Minnesota. And the scientists wanted to see the effect of lifestyle, especially cognitive activity, on brain health. So these amazing nuns, they dedicated their brains and their bodies to science. And after they passed away, they had brain autopsies done. So they were able to look at the pathology of brain diseases in them as well. And they found out that, there was a group of nuns that had, very, very bad looking brains. It was just riddled with Alzheimer's kind of pathologies with tau proteins and tangles. But yet right before death, they were absolutely fine. They did not have any of the manifestations of disease, which was, very surprising. And yet they looked at another group that had okay looking brains. Their brains actually were very nice looking and they didn't have the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And yet right before death, they actually had fulminant Alzheimer's disease. And so the discrepancy threw all the scientists off. And what is going on? How is it possible that a person could have this kind of a brain and yet not have any symptoms, but in a good-looking brain and have symptoms? They went back and they looked at their life. They went back and they looked at their diaries. And the ladies or the nuns who had brains riddled with pathology of Alzheimer's disease and yet they didn't have any signs, they had very complex lives. They were involved in their communities. They were involved in service. They were best communicators. They had very high vocabularies. And when they looked at the other group who had Alzheimer's disease, they were withdrawn. They were not very involved. They were not involved in very complex lives. And so that supported the concept of cognitive resilience that one can build during our lives. So we came up with this Venn diagram. With all the data that we have, if we live right here at the center of these three concepts, which is complexity, challenge, and purpose, that's where cognitive resilience is built most. Challenge, okay, let's start with complexity. So complexity means having complex lives, having something that challenges our brains, having good stress in our lives, whether it's school, whether it's being involved in church, whether it's in volunteering in the community, whether it's speaking at all times, whether it's lifelong learning, all of that is complexity. Challenge is pushing it to the next level. If somebody knows how to play the piano, and if you know a couple of songs, after a while you can close your eyes and you can play the song and you'll get it. So the next step is to learn something different, learn another language, go to the next level of your job, take on another project, take on another degree. I'm not doing that, Dean is. I tell Dean, you have more degrees than a thermometer. But so challenging yourself more and more is incredibly important. And all of that is meaningless if it's not connected to our purpose. I know it sounds soft. I know this is probably not very scientific, but I think purpose is the binding component of everything that we just talked about. When we have a purpose in life, when we have a vector and a direction to follow, the complexity and the challenge, they fall in place. People tend to have better nutrition if they have purpose. They have better exercise patterns if they have purpose. Their stress is managed better if they have an important purpose in life. And it can be as small as helping people or as grand as helping the world. It doesn't matter. But something that keeps us in line. And so this is the most important and we believe the most helpful model of achieving optimal brain capacity and preventing this devastating disease of the brain. So with that, I come to the end of the talk. We believe that brain health starts at home and it starts at work and it starts in our communities. It starts right here. Every single decision we make, whether it's the kind of foods we eat or the kind of activities that we are involved in or the purpose we follow or we choose, determines our brain capacity and our brain health. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm part of this amazing university and hoping to make a difference in this world. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Sherzai. We have a lot of time for questions. Last year, there were many, 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 many questions. So hands are shooting up. We'll get started right in the front.
In blue zone areas, do you find the incidence of dementia is substantially less? Has that been documented?
Yes, definitely. Definitely in Loma Linda. Some of the other ones haven't really been studied. They're just reports. But the ones that have been published in Loma Linda, we definitely do see a lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease in blue zones. Yes.
More questions?
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Sherzai. The statement that cholesterol leads to Alzheimer's, it seems that not all the authorities agree with that. I know a lot of these studies they're cohorts, and so sometimes the confounding factors are impossible to rule out. How can we be sure that confounding factors don't account for this finding?
Well, they're adjusted in different studies, and the ones that I presented to you have been published in peer-reviewed journals, and the confounding factors have been addressed. And I know that there's a lot of debate going on as far as cholesterol is concerned, but when you look at the largest populations in the world, and it's not just necessarily one study. You have to look at the combination of different studies. So from epidemiological studies and observational studies, and even the studies that are done, on a few individuals, I know that that's small. We know that cholesterol, not necessarily cholesterol intake, but the levels of cholesterol that are affected by saturated fat intake can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And that's been known. And when you look at other models of dementia, vascular dementia and minor strokes, cholesterol levels actually increase that as well. So when you look at the different lines, it completely makes sense how it can damage brain cells and result in Alzheimer's disease.
Have we seen any randomized controlled trials that have kind of settled that question once and for all?
They're very small. There was one that was done a couple of years ago. It's very difficult to do randomized controlled trials of food on individuals. I mean, you have to understand that. How do you make sure that people eat what you tell them to eat? And how do you make sure that you see it for long term? And especially for a disease like dementia, there's some physicians that are doing studies that want to look at cognitive outcomes within 6 months. You're not going to see any cognitive outcomes within 6 months. You have to follow them for a good 3 to 5 to 10 years, and there's no funding to do that. And I think people don't eat that way. They can't really control themselves to eat that cleanly for a long period of time. So what we rely on is the amount of data that comes from observational studies and the smaller studies, and it indicates that it's a very important risk factor.
Question over here.
Once symptoms develop, is there any possibility of reversal if you do drastic changes in these things that you've described?
If I understand it properly, you're saying, is it possible to reverse when the disease develops?
And once people develop symptoms, yes.
Thank you for that question. I think I forgot to mention that. It's very important for us to know that once the disease develops, it's very hard to reverse it. You can reverse it in the mild cognitive impairment stage, and we do have evidence for that. But in the moderate to advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, there's nothing that can be done, because by then 60 to 70% of neurons have been affected. And I know that a lot of people are trying to push the concept of Alzheimer's reversal, and I think that's borderline criminal. They're selling vitamins and minerals to them, and we see several programs and protocols floating around in the country, and there's no objective evidence that that's helpful.
Question up here to the left.
Yes.
Any studies done about the vegetarian meat? I mean, they have a lot of chemicals, fat, and everything. Anything
Right.
done?
No, not yet. We're actually hoping to do that. We were talking to the CEO, the group that manages Beyond Meat. You've heard of Beyond Meat as a processed meat. And, with concern that people have for animals and for the environment, a lot of people are moving more towards Beyond Meat and Beyond Burgers and the Impossible Burgers. They're highly processed. They do have saturated fats. Yeah, maybe they're a little better than meat. And what we say is it's a good transition to go plant-based, but no studies yet, but we're hoping to do that soon. We're actually in the middle of conversations. Yeah. Yes, sorry. Yes.
Could you comment on the role of hormones? I'm talking about estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, young, optimal life levels versus the age-related decline in these hormones. And how does that contribute to, and what role does that play here?
Definitely. So we do have evidence that, a decline in estrogen levels, and especially in women after menopause, that increases the risk of cognitive impairment. And multiple studies have shown that it's important to address the changes in hormones and maybe starting hormone replacement therapy as soon as possible. And it's the timing that matters more. It's actually the earlier you start the conversation in the hormone replacement therapy, the better. But still, as far as testosterone and male hormones are concerned, we don't have good objective evidence. But for women, there seems to be some benefit of starting hormone replacement therapy early. How long do you continue? That indefinitely so far. But again, that has to be determined with better studies. No studies so far.
Could you address the issue of soy-based protein foods, and is there any relationship to Alzheimer's?
Soy? Yes. So there is no harmful effect of soy that has been seen. Beneficial, definitely, yeah. People who consume soy proteins, specifically tofu, edamame, and I'm forgetting the other one, tempeh. So the unprocessed soy products, they tend to do better. They've done studies in Okinawa, Japan, and in China, and from the China study, they actually tend to do much better. They haven't looked at neuropsychological test scores specifically and soy consumption, but for brain health in general and better vascular health, soy protein is great. Yes.
What do you do for the patient with a normal B12 and folic acid levels, but they have a rather high homocysteine in the 10 to 15 range? Do you use an L-methylfolate or test them for the MTHFR mutations?
That's the time to go into some of the esoteric testing then. Yes. To find out why is it that they still have high homocysteine levels.
Question here?
Yes.
I was hoping you'd say some positive words about chocolate.
Oh, I forgot. I actually forgot. No, chocolate is great. There have been multiple studies that showed that chocolate, without the sugar, the pure dark chocolate actually improves blood flow, cerebral blood flow. And there was a small study that showed that chocolate consumption was associated with lower risk of stroke. So chocolate is good, especially cocoa powder. Yeah, it's the sugar that kind of negates the beneficial effects. Yes.
I believe it was about a month ago. There's an article, I think it was in JAMA, that it was done in the Netherlands, showing that B12 supplementation increased all-cause mortality.
Yes. I looked at that paper, and I think they didn't really address the confounding factors very well. That population had so many holes in the data. We didn't know anything about their exercise pattern. We didn't know much about their dietary patterns. We just knew that they were taking vitamin B12 supplements. And they actually had underlying morbidities that weren't accounted for. So I just put a big question mark on that paper because it wasn't done very cleanly. And there are a lot of papers like that show associations between one thing and another, but when you go down deep and see whether they addressed all of the factors, they usually don't. So.
Question here.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about the levels of HDL versus LDL cholesterol? And
So,
I have a patient, I know someone with mild cognitive impairment.
yes.
The HDL cholesterol is very high, over 80, and the LDL is about 130.
Okay. All right. So unlike cardiac or heart disease, the role of HDL for brain health is unknown, and more emphasis is placed on reducing LDL. LDL, no matter how high HDL is, if your LDL is above 100, it doesn't matter. So the focus is always on lowering LDL as much as possible. ideally between 70 to 100 for people who don't have vascular risk factors like diabetes and high blood pressure, but lower than that if they do.
Question over to the right.
Yes.
I like your comment on ground nuts and tree nuts.
They're amazing.
Both.
So the type of nuts that have been studied for brain health, pecans have been studied and walnuts have been studied a lot. And walnuts seem to have, so it's the ratio of omega-3 and omega-6. The higher omega-3, the better. The lower the omega-6, the better. And walnut seems to have that ratio. So yeah, walnuts are great. Walnut is a tree nut, yes. Peanuts are actually higher in omega-6 fatty acids. And so when you look at, it's all about a spectrum, right? Which one is better than the other? So when you see the spectrum, you have walnut at the top, and you have pecans, hazelnuts, and I think there are a couple of other, Brazil nuts and cashews and almonds, yes. And then peanut is right at the bottom. Yeah, so some more walnuts, I suppose.
Another question over here.
Yes.
You didn't mention anything about social interaction. What did it do when you have social support and that sort of thing, and how that helps prevent dementia?
Yes. Well, I was hoping that it was, creating. I created a good picture about that with the Nun Study. We're social beings. People who are detached, who are not engaged with the society. That might offend some introverts here, but no offense. But people who are not really engaged with other human beings have lower complexity of their cognitive activities. The most complex cognitive activity, believe it or not, is talking to each other and being involved with each other, because it's not just speaking to each other. It's about me making sure that I'm addressing your concerns, me making sure I'm not boring you, me making sure that I make sense. So all of the cognitive domains are working together. Dean always gives a really good example of, Sudoku. I don't know if I talked about Sudoku, but he hates Sudoku. He says, Sudoku will give me dementia because it's, just adding numbers, doing this, and, it's just a couple of numbers and that's it. But if you're involved in a project, it's your memory centers, it's your language center, it's your visual cortex, it's your amygdala, which is your emotion, it's your brain on fire. It's all of it together at the same time, and that provides the most cognitive resilience and reserve. They've actually done studies on people who have hearing deficits. People who can't hear very well, not necessarily deaf, but just have some level of hearing deficit where it creates a lag in the conversation, where they don't really keep up with conversations with their family members and friends. They have a higher risk of developing cognitive impairment. So that also, talks about having, this engaged brain, either it's ambient sound or conversations or being around people, that keeps the brain active as well. So yeah, it is very important.
We have lots of questions and a lot of hands.
Sure.
We'll get to all
I'll
of you.
try my best.
Our next one is over to your right there.
Yeah, we're putting post-stroke patients now on intensive statin medications.
Yes.
And I wonder, in the past we thought of statins as usually for middle-aged people, and now it seems like we should put it in the water and everyone should have a statin. So how long
sadly.
should people stay on statins?
So there's no. So from the studies that look at secondary stroke prevention, which means when somebody has a stroke and you want to prevent another one, or even after TIAs, they have to be on statins indefinitely until their cholesterol levels are lower than 100 and between 70 to 100. I am a big proponent of statin therapy during acute stroke, because it's not just about lowering LDL, the bad cholesterol. It's about the pleiotropic effect of statins, which is the anti-inflammatory effect. It reduces the size of the stroke, the penumbra, which is the stunned neurons around the stroke core. Reducing the size is very important. And it's lifestyle. It's lifestyle. And Dean Ornish has done studies on people who go on a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet, and their LDL plummets within 2 to 3 weeks. Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn in Cleveland Clinic, he's done studies on his patients, and he's published it, where he put people on a very low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet with significant cardiac disease, and he found out, some reversal of their atherosclerosis, but also just a rapid reduction in their LDL So yeah, we put statin in everybody's water, but at the same time we give them beef and chicken and cheese, you know? So it's like, what is going on here? I think we, as a medical community, we haven't really bought into the importance of changing lifestyle along with medication. I think that's the biggest problem.
Also, you alluded to the nutritionals. Every day, patients ask, should I take Prevagen or ginkgo? And then is there a link to low vitamin D levels with memory loss?
Oh, yes, there is. Yes, there is. People who have low vitamin D are at a higher risk. But when that vitamin D is replaced by just getting 15 minutes of sunshine maybe, or just a over-the-counter vitamin D replacement, they're fine. They don't have to buy Prevagen and all the other stuff with it. There's no study that actually proves that Prevagen is good. I get that in my plastic bag sign patients all the time.
Question here.
Yes.
It's probably worth emphasizing that finding these things out is really difficult because, as you mentioned, it's not a study you can do in 6 months. Yeah. It's more like years, sometimes decades.
Absolutely.
And you have to collect all of the information ahead of time. Yes. Because by the time they have dementia, they can't remember what they ate in the last 6 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I remember when I was doing my study, it was like pulling teeth. And even when I got done, I would like to be able to say, well, fish is better for you than other kinds of meat. But we just didn't have the numbers to be able to tease that out.
Right. Absolutely. I thank you for that comment. I think it's very important for people to know that it takes a very long time and the right kind of an approach to study cognitive function and cognitive health in human beings. And everybody keeps on harping on the fact that, well, there's no clinical trials. How can you say that? But, again, yes, there are no clinical trials, but we have enough information to know which direction to go to. We have enough information from observational studies, from community studies, that eating a certain way is better. And why should we? I think that's exactly what happened with the smoking studies and the tobacco companies. For years and years and years, after thousands of papers available showing that smoking was associated with lung cancer and high cardiovascular mortality, public health departments weren't ready to make any changes. Well, obviously because of some lobbyists there trying to, cause some impediments. But, you can't follow people for 70 years, wait for 70 years, see what happens, and then make recommendations. So you have to be able to look at cross-sectional studies and epidemiological observational studies and small, anecdotes even, and make a decision. Thank you for that statement. Yes?
What's your advice for a 30-year professional career of call every 6 nights and up all night shifts? What's the prognosis or the risk there?
Well, the good news is the cognitive reserve is going to take care of a whole lot of things. And then, life is not perfect. So emphasizing more on healthy diet and exercising and finding meaning and purpose in those calls, I think that's wonderful. I mean, I know a lot of people who don't sleep and who have extremely busy lives, but they're the sharpest people I know because they've taken care of the rest of the aspects.
Question up here. Lots of hands. We'll get to you. We have plenty of time, but our next question is way in the back here.
Early on in your slide presentation, you mentioned that the women were much more likely to have this problem. Is that age matched against the men?
Yes, it is.
Can you kind of comment on what risks they have that would push them towards that trend?
So these are, so when they write national reports and guideline reports like this, they've looked at women who were born, say, in the 1930s and 40s and, who are elderly now and they have higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. Things are shifting and changing. For now, we know that women have a higher proclivity for vascular diseases. So, if they have high blood pressure, it affects their brain blood vessels more than it affects men. And they don't seem to have more reserve and resilience. There have been studies that have looked at, and I mentioned it briefly, that have looked at education as a proxy of cognitive reserve. And it seems to have been lower in women compared to men back then. And it's very interesting to see that shift that, women are now more educated or as educated as men are, and whether this cognitive reserve is going to be protected from here on. So we do kind of see a little bit of a shift in that number slowly and gradually. But so far, with the population that we have right now, it's mostly vascular diseases.
Next question,
Yes.
right down here.
Could you speak to iron and how low iron has an effect on children? Does it have any effect on adults?
Low iron on children's brain. So they haven't looked at specifically iron, iron consumption. There have been smaller tests, but they haven't been associated with cognitive state per se. There's been a couple of studies that looked at the quality of iron, whether it's heme iron or non-heme iron. And heme iron seems to actually increase inflammation and oxidation in small vessels. So meat products may be damaging because of the heme iron compared to plant irons, which are non-heme. But, we still need to look at it a little better.
We need to give the right side of the room a
Yes,
little
I need to move out here.
opportunity.
I've been hanging out there more
I
often.
just wanted to know if you have any tips for helping patients change their lifestyle, because it's a lot easier to take a pill than to change your lifestyle, especially if your family is continuing to eat the same way. Society is sort of the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's our goal in our clinic. The reason we came back to Loma Linda was because Loma Linda has the perspective and the heart to allow for a whole person comprehensive care, that you can't really just push people out of your clinic by patting their back and saying, just eat healthy and I'll see you in 3 months. We have to hold their hands and we have to meet them where they are. And that's why it's important to go out into the community. So here in Loma Linda, just making it shorter, we have the Alzheimer's prevention program where we see patients. We prefer to see patients who have mild cognitive impairment because unfortunately there's not much you can do at the advanced stages. And we identify their risk factors and then we put them in a lifestyle program where I actually teach them how to cook and we address some behavioral modification, see where they are and what they can do. Can they exercise? How are their stress levels? Are they able to address their stress levels? How can we help them? We've involved psychology, psychiatry. So it's a multimodal, comprehensive, multifaceted way of addressing this. And we're doing it on a regular basis. And we've seen amazing results. I don't believe in anecdotes. Maybe I should include them in my talks from here on. We're planning on publishing this, but we've noticed that 80 to 90% of dementia can be prevented by just addressing these. And even people who have mild cognitive impairment, they have reversal of their symptoms in the early stages if they address lifestyle. So it's all about small steps of success. We've actually brought in the business model of SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, and making short successes and following them over time.
Next question right here.
I know some church against meditation, and I'd like to know how meditation help brain is not challenging and not complex.
Anything that focuses us on our purpose in life, whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, whether it's engaging with human beings in our community, in our church, that's the most important thing. The reason I brought up meditation is because it's been studied. They basically just stuck people in there and asked them to meditate inside the MRI. I'm pretty sure we really need to look at the effect of prayer on brain health and studying that on MRIs. But I'm pretty sure that we will see effect. So it's all about being able to cut down the noise in our minds and being able to focus on a particular concept or an object or whatever it is and get rid of stress. Focus is the gateway to memory. So the areas in the brain that are responsible for focus is called the precuneus. They found out that people who are involved in some sort of a mindfulness project, whether it's prayer or mindful breathing or meditation, they have larger precunii and they can memorize things better because of being able to focus on something. Sorry. Yes.
Is there a push we seem to focus on the adults. Is there a push to bring any of this information to kids?
Absolutely.
To start the cycle, because otherwise we just...
Absolutely. Absolutely there is. I'm glad you asked that question. About a month ago, a paper came out. And this paper will give you an idea of how important it is to address brain health in children. They looked at adolescents, 12 to 16 years of age, who had poor health, who had poor lifestyle, and they were obese. And they found out that these children actually had insulin resistance and white matter disease in their brain when they did MRIs at that young age. And when they did some testing, they had lower IQs. And they compared them to children who didn't have white matter disease and didn't have obesity and vascular risk factors, and they did much better in their neuropsychological tests. And there was another study that looked at the effect of ApoE4, which is the gene for Alzheimer's disease. Children who had the ApoE4 gene, they actually tended to have a little lower neuropsychological scoring compared to children who didn't have it. So even at that age, lipid metabolism can be affected because of our genes. And so it's very important to talk about the importance of that stage where the brain is multiplying rapidly. Brain cells are being made, connections are being made. And if we are not addressing their lifestyle, their food, their sleep, their exercise patterns, it could affect them negatively. Yes?
Well, besides the short-term memory loss, what aspect of memory can be affected by Alzheimer's dementia? We know those difficulty recalling and naming and all of that. Are they just age-related?
No,
and
they're
then
not.
One question is about olive oil and coconut oil. Are they still good? Olive oil.
The second question was about olive oil?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes. So the first part of the question was, so we know from multiple studies. I had a little bit of a difficulty understanding your question, so I hope I'm answering it correctly. But it looks like people who have very healthy lifestyles, they tend to have better short-term memory, better speed of processing, better judgment and decision-making. These are the different domains of cognition that get affected. Initially in Alzheimer's disease, it's short-term memory gets affected significantly more than other domains of cognition. But then later on, all domains of cognition get affected. But as we grow older, we don't necessarily have to have memory problems. The only thing that gets affected as we grow older is speed of processing, getting information out, quickly. And the analogy that I give out in my community talks is when you're younger, you're like a library. You're a smaller library. You're a kindergarten library where all of the books are stacked on the wall and you know where things are and you go pick it up and you pick it up quickly and that's it, right? So picking up is the action of remembering. But when we grow older, we become like a New York Public Library. So if you want an information, you have to go all the way down to the basement, find the right line and the file and the folder and then look at the names and then pick it up and then walk outside. That's going to take long. That's how the brain works. It takes longer for you to remember things, but the amount of information continues to grow. The amount of wisdom, which is a soft term for just the amount of information that we have mixed with our experiences, our judgment, our decision making, all of that grows and it continues to grow. And if we live a healthy life to make sure that the neuronal connections and the neurons stay healthy, the only thing that will be a little affected is processing, nothing else. We will be sharp. I know, olive oil, yeah, olive oil is good, coconut oil is bad. Short answer, sorry.
I just want to give a shout out to this young gentleman here. He's had his hand up for
I'm
probably
sorry.
15, 20
I'm
minutes.
sorry.
No, it's my fault, and he's been patiently waiting.
Well, it's just the right time because I wanted you to talk about coconut oil.
Yes.
And because I heard something that about median chain triglycerides
Yes,
and the
MCT.
coconut oil just
Yeah.
was almost, it was anecdotal
Panacea.
experiences, but that they had dramatic reversals of, those, I don't know, it was a CEO or something that could remember everything and all the board meetings and what they covered, and then suddenly sort of just went downhill. Couldn't find any cause for it. And somebody told him 2 tablespoons of coconut oil twice a day, and the guy was back to normal.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but there was some talk about, when somebody was commenting on it, that
Yes.
it had to do with medium chain triglycerides.
Right, yes. So coconut oil is interesting. Coconut oil is 90% saturated fats, and it has some other types of, it has different types of saturated fats as well. And the medium chain triglyceride is a type of fat that is available in coconut oil. We know from a large amount of study that saturated fats seem to be unhealthy for brain blood vessels, for the rest of the blood vessels as well. It increases risk of heart attacks and strokes and things of that nature. MCT oil is a part of it. So taking coconut oil because it has MCT is almost like drinking Coke because it has water. You know, it has a lot of other bad things too. They've been able to separate MCT oil from coconut oil and study it separately, but they've studied it in mice and very small number of individuals. So we don't have enough data for it to make any sense and for us to recommend it to everyone. They've also looked at the ketone bodies that are created when people eat or take MCT oils. So ketone bodies are beta hydroxybutyrate, and these can be fuel molecules for the brain if the brain is completely insulin resistant and they can't use glucose. That's the whole idea of ketogenic diet, is you're reducing glucose so much, you're giving them beta hydroxybutyrate, that these stunned neurons that are already riddled with disease, they don't have the receptors for glucose to take it in as a fuel. The ketone bodies don't need any receptors and it goes right in. And so it acts as a fuel for maybe a small amount of time, but is it reversing disease? No. Is it causing any beneficial environment in the brain for it not to progress into more disease? No. And the data is very, very messy, but we're hoping to get more information about that. And most of the studies that have come out from regarding Alzheimer's disease and coconut oil, it started with one person, an anecdote of one. This one lady, a pediatrician, had a husband who had Alzheimer's disease, advanced. She said she gave him coconut oil and he got better. But then he passed away and it was never published. And so based on one story, this entire movement of coconut oil industry started booming around. But we have to be very careful because it can be really harmful.
My wife will be very happy to hear that you've taught me that Coke and water aren't the same thing. So thank you. Two questions here.
You mentioned tofu. I assume you consider that is not a processed food.
It's partially processed, you're right.
But it's okay.
It's okay. It's less processed than other foods.
Now, what about gluten? If you make homemade gluten, is that processed?
It is. I think the word processed essentially means when you separate one element from another and you just eat that apart from everything else. So white bread is processed. Pearled barley is processed because you get rid of the bran. But is it bad? That's the question. So as far as soy is concerned, we know that no, it's not unhealthy, and people who consume soy, they do very, very well. But there's no study that looks at the consumption of soy versus consumption of soybeans and edamame. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like a spectrum, and we don't have any evidence. And we don't have any evidence for gluten either, except that it's bad for people who are gluten sensitive. But other than that, there's no study that shows that it's harmful.
Well, apparently there's some room for processing food a little bit. The manna even was baked and boiled.
Right. Agreed. I mean, it's minimally processed. Let's just call it that. Yes.
BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, appears to come out of muscles. What part of the muscle is actually producing it, and are there other sources of it?
The striated skeletal muscles produce it.
But what part?
The BDNF. Yeah. They basically haven't really gone into the details of finding out where it is. We know that the brain actually creates BDNF to a certain extent as well. So BDNF is created in neurons, in stem cells, and in skeletal muscle as well.
Is it in any food?
No. And people who are selling it in a capsule, it gets destroyed in the gut, so don't buy it.
Another question up to your right.
So, Dr. Sherzai, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your education of patients with regards to lifestyle. The question over here kind of sparked a little bit more inquiry on my part. My parents and I have partnered together and are doing community education. I'm a nurse and enrolled now in Doctor of Public Health program. We've been volunteering in federal prison in Canada for 2 years. We've taken a number of movies like Forks Over Knives, Eating You Alive, Code Blue, Redefining the Practice of Medicine, which I hope you all wrote down, because if you haven't seen those 3 movies, I highly recommend that all of you go home and watch them. And I have a question at the end of this for you. But one of the things, and we do a lot of work in the community, we started a nonprofit, and so we've been working together for 5 years, all volunteer in the community. What we've been seeing with men in prison is amazing. It's a federal prison, minimum security, and they're pre-parole.
Yeah.
So we had a gentleman in November, he gave permission for me to share the story, who came to see Code Blue and had a new diagnosis of MS. And he had asked me after, well, what should I do? And I said, I'm a broken record. We go once a month with a meal. We have roughly 25 to 30 men show up. They eat enough food to feed 50 at least when we're there. And we, for an hour and a half, present health education. I said, go plant-based and start exercising, and the whole kind of New Start thing. He lost 55 pounds. He has regained his vision and his mobility. He was already having significant issues walking, and he's a completely younger looking man, completely reversed. We've had type 2 diabetes reversed, rheumatoid arthritis. One of the employees, we've been in now to actually present to the employees there. I think the question that she asked, well, how do you do it when people want a pill? Yeah. I think it's become a broken record and say whole food plant-based is lifestyle. Good health starts with nutrition, but it doesn't stop there. It's exercise, it's rest, it's air. And so my question is to you and for everybody in the room, with your answer is, what are some of your recommendations for people who are wanting to start? I just shared some of what we do, and that's only a snippet. I mean, we should do movies and we do cooking workshops and label reading things at Whole Foods. But what are your recommendations to help people who are trying to get started with their patients and teaching?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing for the community, and thank you for sharing those beautiful stories. I'm not surprised. I've seen these kind of cases over and over again, and it's very empowering to be in the world of healthcare and to see such results. As far as the recommendations, I think my my talk was all about that. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to rent a protocol or be a part of an entire program. It's identifying risk factors and addressing them. And for people who have risk factors, it's about finding out what the next step of success is, and then taking that step, because New Year's resolution doesn't work. It never has worked. Diets never work. All these programs that people go on, these extreme changes, it never works. It's small steps of success towards a particular behavior, towards a model, and taking the first step. And then finding out from the community, from the healthcare program that they're involved in, anyone that can support them in that journey. But it's all about behavior modification and small steps.
We have time for just one more question. We appreciate you taking all this time,
Of
Dr.
course, my pleasure.
Sherzai.
Hi. I just want to know about your thoughts and details about the keto diet.
Keto diet?
Yeah, because I heard so much up and down, so I don't. Just
Yeah,
wanna
no,
know the
I'm actually in the middle of it. I've studied it. I've written about it. So the ketogenic diet, for people who don't know, is the kind of diet that is about 70% fat, very, very low in carbohydrates, less than 10% carbohydrates, and the rest of it is protein. And the idea is, when you go in a ketogenic diet, you're basically forcing your body to act as if it's in a starvation mode. And there are certain chemicals that are created in our body, ketone bodies, beta hydroxybutyrate. And, you know, there have been some anecdotal evidence that people lose a lot of weight and they have, their brain fog goes away and so on and so forth. But most of the studies that you see as far as brain health is concerned, they're all feasibility studies, which means they just wanted to find out whether people can do it or not, and they couldn't. It's hard. And, you know, small populations to see if there was any effect in cognition. And the cognitive function did not improve. As a matter of fact, after they stopped ketogenic diet, it actually got worse. And again, it's, you know, it may work in people who want to lose massive amount of weight, but my husband Dean jokes around all the time. He's funny. He says, there are other ways of losing weight too, if you want to do it in an unhealthy way. Cutting off your arm, you know, cancer can help make you lose weight. Smoking makes you lose weight. Would you want to do that? So it's a very, very unhealthy way because, again, we're exposed to a whole lot of saturated fats, which causes damage to the endothelium. Some individuals are actually looking at plant-based ketogenic diets, you know, with very high poly and monounsaturated fats. But again, we don't have enough evidence. And I think it just creates a little bit of noise and confusion. When you have enough evidence knowing that a whole food plant-based diet can help the brain, heart, lower cancer risk, diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, why would you want to do something else that is harmful and that you don't have enough evidence for?
Thank you very, very, very
Thank
much.
you.
Let's give her a round of
Thank
applause.
you very much. Thank you so much.